The biting wind, sharp as shattered glass, whipped across the frozen plains of eastern Germany, carrying with it the scent of pine and the distant, unsettling rumble of artillery. For Sergeant Thomas "Tommy" Jefferson, the cold was more than just a physical discomfort. It was a constant, gnawing reminder of his predicament. December 1944. The war, which had seemed a distant, glorious crusade back in training, had devolved into a brutal, grinding reality, and now he was a prisoner of war, stripped of his rifle, his uniform, and his pride. He huddled deeper into his threadbare overcoat, the rough wool scratching against his skin. Around him, the other American POWs, a mix of weary, dazed, and defiant faces, did the same. They'd been rounded up after a brutal skirmish, a chaotic retreat that had left them isolated and overwhelmed. The initial shock had long since faded, replaced by the gnawing emptiness of hunger and the gnawing fear of the unknown. Tommy's gaze drifted to the towering barbed wire fences, glinting like icy veins under the weak winter sun. Beyond them lay the grim silhouette of Stalag 17B, a place spoken of in hushed, fearful tones by those who had passed through its gates. He'd heard the whispers from other Allied prisoners during their brief, brutal march. The guards were a brutal lot, quick with their rifle butts and contemptuous of their captives. And for the Black American soldiers, the whispers held an extra layer of dread. The prevailing wisdom, both on the battlefield and, it seemed, within the German military machine, was that black men, particularly those from America, were simple laborers, uneducated and easily intimidated. Tommy's jaw tightened. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. He was a graduate of Howard University, a scholar of literature and languages, fluent in German thanks to a scholarship that had taken him to Heidelberg before the war. He'd been on a Fulbright exchange, immersing himself in the very culture that now held him captive. He remembered the thrill of debating philosophy in a smoky German beer hall, the intellectual camaraderie he'd shared with his German counterparts. Now, that same language, that same knowledge, felt like a dangerous, double-edged sword. Beside him, Private First Class Samuel "Sam" Jones shivered, his teeth chattering audibly. Sam was a brilliant engineer, a graduate of MIT, whose mind was as sharp as any German strategist's. He'd been drafted straight out of college, his dreams of designing innovative machinery deferred by the demands of war. He, too, spoke fluent German, a necessity for his specialized studies that had involved close collaboration with German engineers on certain pre-war projects. "Cold, huh, Tommy?" Sam's voice was a low rasp. "Colder than a landlord's heart, Sam," Tommy replied, forcing a weak smile. He knew Sam was more than just a fellow prisoner. He was a comrade in arms and in intellect. They'd bonded during basic training, discovering a shared appreciation for the finer points of literature and a mutual disdain for the casual racism they'd often encountered, even within their own ranks. As they were herded through the gates, the harsh clang of metal on metal echoing in the frigid air, Tommy braced himself. The guards, clad in their drab Feldgrau uniforms, their faces etched with a mixture of boredom and suspicion, eyed them with a palpable disdain. Their expressions seemed to convey a clear message: you are less than human, you are here to be broken. A particularly burly guard, his face sallow and his eyes like chips of ice, barked an order in guttural German. Tommy understood every word, but he kept his gaze fixed on the muddy ground, feigning ignorance. He watched as another guard, younger and with a flicker of curiosity in his eyes, nudged his companion. "Was sagen Sie?" the younger guard asked, his voice laced with a hint of uncertainty. The older guard scoffed. "Nichts Wichtiges. Sie sind nur Neger." "Nothing important. They are just niggers." The word, spat out like venom, hung heavy in the air. Tommy felt a surge of anger, hot and fierce, beneath the icy veneer he was trying to maintain. He saw Sam stiffen beside him, his knuckles white where he gripped his threadbare blanket. They had endured the insults, the slurs, the condescension, both at home and abroad. But this was different. This was a calculated assumption of intellectual and cultural inferiority, a deliberate attempt to dehumanize them. Their barracks were little more than drafty wooden sheds, crammed with crude wooden bunks. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale sweat, and the ever-present dampness that seeped into everything. As they were shoved inside, the guards continued their barrage of guttural commands interspersed with derisive laughter. Tommy watched the faces of his fellow black soldiers. Some looked resigned, their spirits already flagging. Others, like himself and Sam, held a flicker of defiance in their eyes, a silent promise that they would not be easily broken. They were soldiers, yes, but they were also men with minds and souls that deserved respect. He caught Sam's eye. A shared understanding passed between them, a silent pact forged in the crucible of shared experience and mutual respect. They would not be defined by the prejudices of their captors. They would speak, they would think, and they would, in their own way, fight back. The war, Tommy knew, was far from over, and for him it had just taken a very unexpected turn. He had a language, a knowledge, and a history that his captors couldn't possibly comprehend. And in the grim confines of Stalag 17B, that was a weapon. The first few days were a blur of forced labor, meager rations, and the constant oppressive presence of the guards. They were assigned to digging trenches, hauling heavy equipment, and other tasks designed to exhaust and humiliate them. The guards, expecting sullen obedience, were often met with a quiet diligence that bordered on indifference, which seemed to unnerve them more than outright defiance. One afternoon, while clearing rubble from a bombed-out building, a group of German officers, resplendent in their crisp uniforms, surveyed the work with critical eyes. One of them, a portly man with a walrus mustache, gestured dismissively at the haphazard pile of debris. "Unordnung," he boomed, his voice echoing through the ruins. "Absolute chaos. These men have no discipline, no understanding of order." Tommy, who was hauling a particularly heavy beam, paused for a moment. He glanced at the officer, then at the way the debris had been piled. His mind, trained in the principles of engineering and demolition, immediately recognized the inefficiencies. He saw a better, faster way to clear the area, a method that would minimize the risk of further collapse and maximize the speed of removal. An impulse born of a lifetime of ingrained problem-solving seized him. He took a deep breath, and in flawless, crisp German, he spoke. "Verzeihen Sie, Herr Offizier," Tommy said, his voice calm and measured, cutting through the officer's bluster like a honed blade. "Mit Verlaub, aber Ihre Einschätzung ist nicht ganz zutreffend. Es gibt eine Methode, die deutlich effizienter wäre." "Excuse me, Herr Officer. With all due respect, your assessment is not entirely accurate. There is a method that would be significantly more efficient." The effect was instantaneous and profound. The officers, who had been casually observing the black POWs as one might observe livestock, froze. Their heads snapped towards Tommy, their mouths agape. The burly guard who had been supervising them, a man named Sergeant Muller, his face a perpetual scowl, sputtered in disbelief. "Was hat der Kerl gesagt?" Muller stammered, looking at his fellow guards as if they'd suddenly sprouted wings. The portly officer, his face now a shade of puce, stared at Tommy, his eyes wide with shock. He'd expected grunts, perhaps a mumbled curse, but certainly not a sophisticated critique delivered in his native tongue. Sie sprechen Deutsch?" the officer stammered, the word tasting foreign on his tongue. Tommy inclined his head slightly, a gesture of respect that seemed to further disorient the officer. "Ja, Herr Offizier, ich spreche Deutsch, und ich habe einige Studien in Militärtaktik und Ingenieurwesen abgeschlossen, bevor der Krieg begann." "Yes, Herr Officer, I speak German, and I completed some studies in military tactics and engineering before the war began." The younger guard, the one with the curious eyes, stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Tommy. "Sie studierten in Deutschland?" "You studied in Germany?" "In Heidelberg, ja," Tommy confirmed, his voice still steady. He could feel the eyes of every guard, every officer on him. He could feel the anticipation and the confusion, and he suspected a nascent flicker of something else, perhaps even grudging respect. The portly officer, after a moment of stunned silence, puffed out his chest, attempting to regain some semblance of authority. "Und was schlagen Sie vor, Soldat?" "And what do you propose, soldier?" he demanded, his voice regaining some of its bluster, though a tremor of uncertainty still ran through it. Tommy gestured with his chin towards the pile of rubble. "Wenn wir die größeren Träger zuerst entfernen, die auf den kleineren ruhen, und dann die kleineren in einer geordneten Weise abtragen, anstatt sie willkürlich zu stapeln,
können wir die Arbeit in der Hälfte der Zeit erledigen und das Risiko eines Einsturzes minimieren.
Außerdem wird das Material für die spätere Wiederverwendung vorbereitet. If we remove the larger beams first, those resting on the smaller ones, and then clear the smaller debris in an orderly fashion, rather than piling it haphazardly, we can complete the work in half the time and minimize the risk of collapse. Furthermore, it prepares the material for later reuse. He spoke with the clarity and precision of a seasoned engineer, laying out his strategy with an almost academic detachment. He then added, with a subtle emphasis, es ist eine Methode, die in vielen Bauprojekten der Reichsbahn angewendet wird, die Effizienz zu maximieren. It is a method employed in many Reichsbahn construction projects to maximize efficiency. He'd learned that detail from his engineering studies, knowing it would resonate with their sense of national pride and efficiency. A stunned silence descended upon the scene. The officers exchanged bewildered glances. Sergeant Muller, his face a mask of disbelief, looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. He had expected uneducated laborers, men who knew nothing beyond the fields they'd tilled or the factories they'd worked in. He had not expected a university graduate, a scholar, who spoke their language better than some of their own recruits, and who understood military and engineering principles with a clarity that was frankly unsettling. The portly officer, after a long contemplative pause, slowly nodded. He looked at Tommy, then at the rubble, then back at Tommy. A flicker of something, curiosity, perhaps even a grudging admiration, crossed his features. Zeigen Sie es uns, the officer said, his voice softer now, the bluster replaced by a genuine intrigue. Show us. Tommy, with a nod, turned to his fellow black soldiers. He spoke to them, not in English, but in rapid, fluent German, explaining the new plan, his voice clear and authoritative. He saw the surprise on their faces, quickly followed by a dawning understanding, and then a surge of pride. They, too, had been underestimated. They, too, had hidden strengths. As Tommy began to direct the work, his German flowing effortlessly, correcting the placement of a beam here, suggesting a different angle for clearing rubble there, the guards watched, their mouths agape. Sergeant Muller, his usual swagger replaced by a look of utter confusion, stood rooted to the spot, his carefully constructed worldview crumbling around him. The black POWs, far from being simple laborers, were proving to be intelligent, educated, and disturbingly competent. The war, Tommy thought with a grim satisfaction, was about to get a lot more interesting. The guards had come, expecting to break them. Instead, they were beginning to be educated. The biting wind, sharp as shattered glass, whipped across the frozen parade ground, carrying with it the scent of coal smoke and the distant metallic tang of industry. Sergeant Thomas Tommy Jefferson stood rigid, his threadbare overcoat, the rough wool scratching his neck, doing little to ward off the December chill. Around him, the other black POWs, their faces etched with a mixture of exhaustion and a dawning, incredulous hope, watched the scene unfold. The portly German officer, Obersturmführer Brandt, had finally lowered the cigar he'd been gesturing with, his jowls quivering slightly with something that wasn't entirely anger. Bewilderment was a more accurate descriptor. Brandt had expected a grunt, a simple laborer who would stammer out an apology or, at best, a mumbled "Jawohl." Instead, he'd been met with a cascade of precise, unaccented German, a critique of his own unit's excavation techniques, and a detailed explanation of how to optimize the clearing of the bombed-out building. Tommy had spoken with the measured cadence of a university lecturer, his voice cutting through the officer's bluster like a honed blade. "So," Brandt finally managed, his German rougher, laced with a guttural accent that Tommy, a scholar of Goethe and Schiller, found almost jarring, "You are an engineer, Sergeant?" He spat the word out, as if the concept itself was an affront. Tommy inclined his head, a subtle gesture that spoke volumes of controlled dignity. "My training at Howard University included a significant focus on civil engineering, Obersturmführer. Coupled with my elective studies in German language and literature, it provided a rather comprehensive education." He allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile to touch his lips. "I find that understanding the mechanics of building, much like understanding the nuances of language, requires a certain logical precision. Sergeant Miller, the stocky guard who had been barking orders with his usual brutish efficiency moments before, now stood a few paces behind Brant, his mouth slightly agape. He'd always assumed these Black Americans were just other, different, inferior. They were prisoners, after all. Prisoners were meant to be broken, not to school their captors in engineering and linguistics. He'd seen them working, yes, but he'd never looked at them, not really. He'd seen the color of their skin and filled in the blanks with the crude stereotypes fed to him by Goebbels' propaganda. Brant puffed out his chest, his brief moment of shock receding, replaced by a flicker of his former arrogance. He wasn't about to be outdone by a prisoner, especially not a black one. Howard University, he scoffed, the name foreign and unimpressive to him. And you believe your studies are relevant to this task? We have trained soldiers for this. With all due respect, Obersturmführer, Tommy replied, his gaze steady. Your trained soldiers appear to be clearing rubble as if they were excavating a medieval fosse. The objective is to remove the debris efficiently and safely, not to perform a ritualistic demolition. Observe. Tommy then turned to the men behind him. Jungs, he said, his voice clear and commanding. Wir brauchen diese Trümmer weg. Schnell. Achtet auf die tragenden Wände, stellt die Balken hier, um die Stütze zu gewährleisten. Sammelt zuerst die kleineren Stücke. Sam, du überwachst die Lasten. Konzentriert euch auf die Effizienz, nicht auf die Kraft. The men who moments before had been trudging through the snow with a weary resignation now moved with a newfound purpose. They understood. Sam Jones, an engineering graduate from MIT, his own fluency in German honed by years of dedicated study, was already directing a small group, his gestures precise, his German crisp and authoritative. They worked with a coordinated rhythm, a silent understanding passing between them. They were no longer just POWs clearing debris. They were a highly efficient engineering unit, temporarily employed under duress. Brant watched, his eyes narrowing. He couldn't deny what he was seeing. The speed, the organization, the sheer competence. It was undeniable. These men weren't just following orders, they were interpreting, optimizing, and executing with a level of skill that would impress any Feldwebel. He glanced at Mueller, who merely shrugged, his own confusion palpable. You speak German very well, Sergeant, Brant said, the grudging admission heavy on his tongue. Danke, Obersturmführer, Tommy replied. My mother was a linguist. She believed that understanding the language of your adversary, or indeed any language, was a sign of respect, and perhaps a useful tool. A useful tool. The words hung in the air. Brant looked from Tommy to Sam, then to the other black soldiers working with focused intensity. He saw not the caricatures of ignorance and subservience that had been presented to him, but intelligent, capable men. Men who understood engineering, who spoke his language better than many of his own recruits, and who were currently demonstrating a level of tactical thinking that, frankly, he hadn't expected from anyone in this camp, let alone these particular prisoners. He took a long drag from his cigar, the smoke curling into the frigid air. This was problematic. If these men were capable of this, what else were they capable of? What other useful tools did they possess? His mind, accustomed to simple categorizations of friend and foe, superior and inferior, struggled to process this new data. This is unexpected, Brant admitted, his voice lower. He turned to Miller. Miller, ensure the work continues, and have the cook prepare extra rations for these men tonight. They have demonstrated their value. Miller blinked, unsure he'd heard correctly. Extra rations? For prisoners? But he nodded, a flicker of something akin to respect, or at least a profound sense of bewilderment, softening his usually harsh features. He'd seen plenty of men break under the strain of captivity, but these Black Americans, they seemed to be thriving, in their own way, by simply being themselves. As the day wore on, the work continued with an efficiency that left the German guards speechless. Tommy and Sam, working in tandem, oversaw the operation. They discussed load-bearing capacities in German, debated the most effective angles for leverage, and even corrected a minor miscalculation by one of the German overseers regarding the structural integrity of a partially collapsed wall. Tommy delivered the correction with polite deference, but the underlying message was clear. You are wrong, we know better. By the time the meager rations were distributed that evening, a palpable shift had occurred. The usual hostility and contempt in the eyes of many guards had been replaced by a mixture of curiosity and unease. Sergeant Miller, during his rounds, found himself pausing longer at the barracks housing the Black POWs. He watched them as they ate their thin soup, their conversations animated, their laughter, though subdued, resonating with a natural camaraderie. He noticed the books some had managed to keep, dog-eared paperbacks, and even a worn copy of Moby Dick. He'd never associated books with men who were supposed to be laborers, men who were supposed to be less. Later that night, huddled in the frigid barracks, the rough wool of their blankets a scant comfort, Tommy and Sam spoke in low tones. The gnawing emptiness in their stomachs was a constant companion, but it was overshadowed by the quiet triumph of the day. "They looked like they'd seen ghosts, Tommy," Sam whispered, a grin playing on his lips. "Miller's face when you corrected that officer, priceless." Tommy chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "It's not about making them feel foolish, Sam. It's about reminding them that we are not the caricatures they imagine. We are men, educated men, soldiers." "But it is satisfying, isn't it," Sam pressed, "to see the look on their faces when their entire worldview gets a good shake-up. They expected us to be simple, to be easily managed. They expected us to be them, but with darker skin. They never factored in the possibility of us having an education, of us knowing their language, their culture, their military regulations better than they do." "It's a weapon, Sam," Tommy said, his voice serious. "Knowledge. It's the only weapon they can't take away from us. They can break our bodies, starve us, freeze us, but they can't break our minds unless we let them. We use what we have, the language, the engineering, the literature. It all serves a purpose. It reminds them, and more importantly, it reminds us of who we are." Sam nodded, pulling his blanket tighter. "I just wonder what happens next. Will they treat us differently? Or will they just find new ways to try and break us?" Tommy stared up at the rough-hewn beams of the barracks ceiling, his mind already racing ahead, calculating probabilities, strategizing. "That, my friend, is the question. But one thing is certain, they will never look at us the same way again. And in this game, perception is a powerful ally. They underestimated us. Now they have to reckon with the reality. And that, Sam, is a beautiful thing." The next morning, the wind still howled, the snow still fell. The routine of the camp, brutal and unforgiving, was set to continue. But as Tommy and his fellow black soldiers marched out to their assigned tasks, there was a subtle difference in their bearing. Their heads were held a little higher, their steps a little more purposeful. They were still prisoners, still facing an enemy that held them captive, but they were also something else entirely. A walking, talking refutation of prejudice, a living testament to the power of intellect and resilience, and a stark reminder to their captors that the war and the men fighting it were far more complex than they had ever imagined. The game had changed, and Tommy Jefferson, with his fluent German and his sharp mind, had just made the first crucial move. The full implications of that move, however, were yet to unfold. The extra rations, a meager offering of stale bread, and a thin slice of ersatz sausage felt like a king's feast. Tommy broke his piece in half, offering a portion to Sam. The biting wind, sharp as shattered glass, whipped across the desolate parade ground, stinging any exposed skin. The POWs, a motley collection of uniforms, worn thin and faces etched with hunger, huddled together for warmth, their breath pluming in the frigid air. But beneath the shared hardship, a new current flowed, a silent, potent awareness. The German guards, their Feldgrau greatcoats a stark contrast to the muddy browns and grays of the prisoners, watched with a new wariness. The casual contempt that had been their default setting was now laced with a flicker of something else. Confusion, perhaps even a grudging respect. Sergeant Miller, the burly guard who usually barked orders with relish, now kept a wary distance, his gaze lingering on Tommy and Sam. Obersturmführer Brandt, the portly officer whose pride had been so thoroughly pricked, had retreated to his command post, no doubt to process the unprecedented humiliation, yet his order for extra rations echoed Tommy's calculated risk. It was a small victory, a crack in the monolithic wall of German arrogance, but a victory nonetheless. "See, Sam?" Tommy murmured, his voice low, barely audible above the wind's howl. They expected us to be simple laborers, plowshares, not swords. Sam nodded, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips as he chewed the tough bread. And we gave them a taste of the finely honed steel they didn't know we possessed. Goethe and excavation techniques. Imagine that. He chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. I almost feel sorry for Brant. He's gonna have nightmares about quadratic equations and Roman aqueducts, I reckon. He'll have nightmares about us, Tommy corrected, his eyes scanning the compound. About the fact that the men they've been treating like cattle are, in fact, men, educated men, men who can speak their language better than they can. The incident had rippled through the barracks, a hushed, excited buzz. Word spread like wildfire. Sergeant Thomas Jefferson, the quiet, scholarly-looking fellow, had stood toe-to-toe with a German officer and won, not with fists, not with brute force, but with words, with knowledge, with a command of their own language that had left the officer speechless. For the black soldiers, it was more than just a personal triumph. It was a reclamation of dignity. They had been stripped of their uniforms, their freedom, their very humanity, but this was a reclaiming of their minds. The following days were a study in subtle shifts. The guards' taunts became less frequent, replaced by a watchful silence. When they did speak, their German often seemed hesitant, less assured. There were instances, small but significant, where a guard would stumble over a word and Tommy or Sam would offer a quiet, almost apologetic correction. Their voices smooth and precise, the guards' faces would contort with a mixture of embarrassment and disbelief, as if they had just witnessed a ghost. One frigid afternoon, during the daily roll call, a new officer arrived to inspect the camp. He was younger than Brant, leaner, with the sharp, imperious gaze of a career soldier. He strode through the assembled POWs, his eyes scanning them with undisguised disdain. He stopped before Tommy and Sam, his gaze fixing on their slightly cleaner uniforms, a subtle distinction born from their recent, albeit minor, recognition. "Where sind Sie?" the officer barked, his voice sharp and cutting. "Was Mackenzie here? Who are you? What are you doing here?" Tommy stepped forward, his posture erect despite the gnawing emptiness in his stomach. "Wir sind amerikanische Kriegsgefangene, Herr Offizier," he replied, his German flowing with an effortless clarity. "Gefangene des Krieges, Sergeant Thomas Jefferson, Private First Class Samuel Jones." "We are American prisoners of war, Sir Officer, prisoners of war. Sergeant Thomas Jefferson, Private First Class Samuel Jones." The officer's eyebrows shot up. His eyes narrowed, scanning Tommy's face as if searching for a hidden trick. He had clearly expected a stammering, broken response, a display of subservience. Instead, he was met with a calm, articulate declaration in flawless German. "Sie sprechen gut Deutsch," the officer stated, a hint of suspicion in his tone. "Woher? You speak German well. Where from?" "Ich habe an der Howard University studiert, Herr Offizier," Tommy said. "Englische Literatur und Romanistik. Deutsch war Teil meines Studiums. I studied at Howard University, Sir Officer, English, literature, and Romance languages. German was part of my studies." He gestured slightly toward Sam. "Mein Kamerad Herr Jones hat am MIT studiert, Ingenieurwesen. Auch spricht Deutsch fließend." "My comrade Mr. Jones studied at MIT, engineering. He, too, speaks German fluently." The officer stared, his face a mask of bewilderment. He exchanged a quick, uncertain glance with Sergeant Muller, who stood a few paces behind, his expression unreadable. The very foundations of their assumptions were being systematically dismantled. These weren't the uneducated, easily managed laborers they had been trained to expect. These were men with university degrees, with a command of language that put many of their own officers to shame. "Ingenieurwesen?" the officer repeated, the word sounding foreign on his tongue. "Sie sind ein Ingenieur?" "Engineering? You are an engineer?" Sam stepped forward then, his voice a quiet counterpoint to Tommy's. "Ja, Herr Offizier, ich habe mich auf Brückenbau spezialisiert." "Yes, Sir Officer, I specialized in bridge construction." He looked pointedly at a section of the camp's perimeter fence, a hastily erected barrier that seemed to sag under its own weight. "Diese Konstruktion
Sie ist nicht optimal. Die Spannweiten sind zu groß für die verwendeten Materialien. Sie wird nicht lange halten. This construction, it is not optimal. The spans are too large for the materials used. It will not hold for long. A stunned silence descended. The officer's mouth hung slightly ajar. He looked from Sam to the fence, then back to Sam, his mind clearly struggling to reconcile the image of a Black American POW critiquing German engineering with the reality before him. Sergeant Miller shifted his weight, his hand instinctively moving towards the rifle slung over his shoulder, as if the very words were a physical threat. The officer, recovering his composure with visible effort, forced a tight smile. Sehr interessant, he said, the words lacking their usual conviction. Wir werden uns das ansehen. Very interesting. We will look into that. He turned abruptly and walked away, the sharp click of his boots on the frozen ground the only sound. Tommy and Sam watched him go, a silent understanding passing between them. They hadn't just corrected his German, they had corrected his entire worldview. They had shown him that the enemy wasn't just a faceless mass of conscripts, but individuals of intellect and capability, individuals who could challenge him on his own terms. Later, back in the cramped, frigid barracks, the news of the encounter spread with even greater fervor. Whispers turned to excited, albeit still hushed, conversations. The older soldiers, those who had endured the longest, looked at Tommy and Sam with a newfound hope. For so long, their intelligence had been a burden, a source of suspicion and resentment from their captors. Now it was becoming their most formidable weapon. They're scared, Tommy, Sam said, his voice filled with a quiet satisfaction. You can see it in their eyes. They don't know what to do with us. They thought they had us all figured out and we just didn't fit. That's the point, Sam, Tommy replied, staring out at the bleak, snow-covered landscape. We don't fit their narrative. We're the anomaly, and anomalies can disrupt entire systems. He paused, a thoughtful expression on his face. Brandt gave us extra rations. This new officer, he'll report back. They'll have to reevaluate. They'll have to acknowledge that we're not just bodies to be worked and starved. We have minds, and those minds are dangerous to their assumptions. The fear was palpable. It wasn't the fear of physical reprisal, though that always lingered. It was a deeper, more unsettling fear of the unknown, of a reality that contradicted everything they believed. They had been taught that black men were inferior, simple, easily manipulated, and here, in the heart of Germany, in a POW camp, meant to break them, they were encountering the exact opposite. The days that followed were marked by a peculiar tension. The guards were more respectful, almost deferential. The harshness remained, but it was now tinged with a hesitant politeness. When a guard needed something translated or a task explained, they would often seek out Tommy or Sam, their requests now phrased as questions rather than commands. Sergeant Jefferson, könnten Sie mir bitte helfen? A guard might ask, his voice unnaturally soft. Dieses Formular, ich verstehe es nicht ganz. Sergeant Jefferson, could you please help me? This form, I don't quite understand it. Tommy would oblige, his German precise and patient, while the guard watched him with a mixture of awe and confusion, as if witnessing a magician perform an impossible feat. Sam, with his technical acumen, found himself in demand for minor repairs around the camp, his explanations of mechanical principles delivered in fluent German, often accompanied by diagrams drawn in the dirt. The change wasn't universal. Some guards remained stubbornly hostile, their prejudice too deeply ingrained to be shaken by a few eloquent speeches. But the tide was turning. The seeds of doubt had been sown, and they were beginning to sprout. One evening, as the prisoners were being herded back into their barracks, a young guard, barely more than a boy, stumbled and dropped a heavy crate of potatoes. The potatoes scattered across the frozen ground, a messy, unappetizing heap. The guard flushed crimson, expecting the usual barrage of curses. Instead, Tommy, who was nearest, knelt down. Kein Problem, Tommy said, his voice gentle. Lassen Sie uns helfen. No problem. Let us help. He began gathering the spilled potatoes, his movements quick and efficient. Sam joined him, and soon a few other POWs, seeing the guard's hesitant inaction, began to assist. The young guard watched, his eyes wide with surprise. He stammered a hesitant Danke schön,
as Tommy handed him a particularly large potato. It was a small gesture, a moment of shared humanity in the midst of brutal captivity, but it spoke volumes. It was a testament to the power of intellect, of empathy, of simply refusing to be defined by the narrow expectations of others. The war raged on outside the barbed wire fences, a distant thunder that seemed to grow louder with each passing day. But within Stalag 17B, a different kind of battle was being fought, a silent war of minds and perceptions. Tommy and Sam, armed with their education and their fluency, were not just surviving. They were subtly, irrevocably, changing the landscape of their own captivity. They had discovered that knowledge, when wielded with precision and courage, could be a weapon more potent than any bullet and a shield more formidable than any armor. The Germans had expected to find laborers. They had found scholars, engineers, and diplomats, men who spoke their language and understood their world better than they did themselves. And that, Tommy knew, was a game changer. The question that now hung in the frigid air was not if their capabilities would be exploited further, but how. The winter was long, but for the Black American POWs of Stalag 17B, the intellectual thaw had just begun. The biting wind, sharp as shattered glass, whipped across the frozen parade ground, carrying with it the scent of coal smoke and the distant metallic tang of industry. Sergeant Thomas "Tommy" Jefferson stood rigid, his threadbare overcoat, the rough wool, scratching his neck, doing little to ward off the December chill. Around him, the other black POWs, their faces etched with a mixture of exhaustion and a dawning, incredulous hope, watched the scene unfold. The portly German officer, Obersturmführer Brandt, had finally lowered the cigar he'd been gesturing with, his jowls quivering slightly with something that wasn't entirely anger. Bewilderment was a more accurate descriptor. Brandt had expected a grunt, a simple laborer who would stammer out an apology or, at best, a mumbled "Jawohl." Instead, he'd been met with a cascade of precise, unaccented German, a critique of his own unit's excavation techniques, and a detailed explanation of how to optimize the clearing of the bombed-out building. Tommy had spoken with the measured cadence of a university lecturer, his voice cutting through the officer's bluster like a honed blade. The extra rations, a meager offering of stale bread, and a thin slice of ersatz sausage felt like a king's feast. Tommy broke his piece in half, offering a portion to Sam. The shared hardship was now underscored by a potent awareness. Their captors had fundamentally underestimated them. The incident had rippled through the barracks, a hushed, excited buzz. Word spread like wildfire. Sergeant Thomas Jefferson, the quiet, scholarly-looking fellow, had stood toe-to-toe with a German officer and won. Not with fists, not with brute force, but with words, with knowledge, with a command of their own language that had left the officer speechless. For the black soldiers, it was more than just a personal triumph. It was a reclamation of dignity. They had been stripped of their uniforms, their freedom, their very humanity, but this was a reclaiming of their minds. The following days were a study in subtle shifts. The guards' taunts became less frequent, replaced by a watchful silence. When they did speak, their German often seemed hesitant, less assured. There were instances, small but significant, where a guard would stumble over a word, and Tommy or Sam would offer a quiet, almost apologetic correction, their voices smooth and precise. The guards' faces would contort with a mixture of embarrassment and disbelief, as if they had just witnessed a ghost. The war raged on outside the barbed wire fences, a distant thunder that seemed to grow louder with each passing day. But within Stalag 17B, a different kind of battle was being fought, a silent war of minds and perceptions. The war eventually ended, not with a bang in the frozen plains of Germany, but with a slow, grinding, and ultimately decisive victory for the Allied forces. For Tommy and Sam, their time in Stalag 17B became a unique chapter, one of both profound hardship and unexpected triumph. Their intellectual prowess, once a source of suspicion, had become their shield, and in a strange way, their leverage. They had not only survived, but they had forced their captors to see them as individuals, as men of intellect and capability, rather than mere stereotypes. After liberation, Tommy returned to a changed America. He completed his doctorate in comparative literature, his experiences in Germany fueling a deep understanding of cultural nuances and the insidious nature of prejudice. He became a renowned professor, his lectures often weaving in personal anecdotes from his time as a POW, teaching not just literature, but the vital importance of critical thinking and empathy. He never forgot the faces of the guards, the bewildered officers, or the quiet dignity of his fellow black soldiers. He advocated tirelessly for civil rights, his voice amplified by the quiet authority of someone who had stared down hatred and emerged not just intact, but enlightened. Sam Jones returned to a nation eager for his engineering skills. He went on to design revolutionary infrastructure projects, his bridges and buildings standing as testaments to his brilliance and resilience. He often spoke of his time as a POW not with bitterness, but with a profound sense of the human capacity for both cruelty and unexpected kindness, and most importantly, the power of education. He and Tommy remained lifelong friends, their bond forged in the crucible of shared adversity and mutual intellectual respect. The aftermath in Stalag 17B was complex. The war crimes trials that followed saw many of the more brutal guards and officers held accountable, their carefully constructed world of racial superiority crumbling under the weight of evidence. But for Tommy, the true victory wasn't in the courtroom, it was in the subtle shift that had occurred within the camp itself. He had demonstrated that true strength lay not in brute force or prejudice, but in intellect, adaptability, and the courage to be oneself, even in the face of dehumanization. The philosophical conclusion, whispered in the quiet moments between Tommy and Sam and echoed in Tommy's later lectures, was clear. Prejudice is born of ignorance, and the most potent weapon against it is knowledge. The war had taught Tommy that freedom was not merely the absence of chains, but the liberation of the mind. They had been prisoners of war, but in the darkest of circumstances they had found a profound freedom within themselves, a freedom that no captor could ever truly take away. The biting wind of Germany had chilled their bodies, but the burning flame of their intellect had kept their souls warm, a beacon that continued to shine long after the last artillery shell had fallen silent.